Welcome to the Dementialand Serial Podcast, a story for everyone who knows someone living in or near Dementialand. My name is Suzka, and this is my story. My name is Suzka. I'm an artist and a painter. I live in a converted warehouse in California. Well, I used to. But I remember clearly that night just before my life was about to change. I stood in the middle of my studio looking at the night's work. Everything around me was resoundingly wet and alive. There must have been at least 20, 30 paint cans, gallon-sized, that sat in the middle of a pool of its color. The cans' rims were gummed like the smile of a toothless old man. Paint, lovely paint, undisciplined, wild, and yummy. Why, I could rub my nose in it and lick it right off the lid. There's a delicious substance to it all. I was working on 5, maybe 6 paintings at the same time. 2 hung on the back wall and 3 laid on the floor. I moved from one to another, sometimes in dance. Paint flew in the air, colors spread far past the canvas edges. Oh, the entire wall was most spectacular. I could not prevent myself from thinking there could be a masterpiece of the century right here before my eyes. A great work of art that would hang in prominent museums, the ones with heavy art decor doors, marbled floors, and domed ceilings. It would hang right next to a Giacometti or a Picasso. Students on field trips would pour out of their buses and run to see the incredible work of art. Other great works in the museum would talk at nighttime after the museum was closed about the Suzka painting going on tour, hanging in other museums throughout the world. Maybe they'd hang in Barcelona or the Pompidou in Paris. My paintings never traveled over the oceans. For now they were wet canvases drying themselves in my warehouse. The whole room was an illusion. Everything was in process of becoming something wonderful. Under its surface was where I lived. I very seldom ventured out. There was no reason to. I shared my studio and talked with the ghosts of de Kooning, Rauschenberg. I slept with Picasso, Giacometti, and Joyce Carey. We were all very close. That particular morning was cold, and cold for California. A breeze came from the open sides of a large roll-up door about 10 feet away from my bed. The roll-up was the main entrance into my warehouse, a rather large cement block structure with only one small window. It was 6:27, the early 6:27 in California. The phone rang 5 times. It was Ellie. Ellie was my mother's close friend. She was 3 decades younger and 8 inches taller. Ellie watched out for my mother, especially in the past year. My mother was somewhat a bit more scattered than usual. It was unlike Ellie to call so god-awful early in the morning. She never called me before noon. "Your mom had an accident," she told me. She fell in the bathroom and hit her head against the counter. She told me my mother had quite a bruise on her eye. She came to morning church, and even the priest stopped the service and went to my mother to see if she was okay. The pastor ended up calling 911, and an ambulance took her to Loyola Hospital. Ellie strongly suggested I should fly back home as soon as I could. According to Ellie, it started like any other morning. A small group of ladies entered the church. Their fingers blindly dove into the holy water fount and then jumped out, flying in the air with its blessings. The women were scattered about the church and settled in their anointed pews. A few shared their space with likenesses to themselves. They pulled rosaries out of their deep pockets, rosaries tangled in Kleenex, and small, sticky, wrapped candies. They prayed in separate dialects the prayers of the rosary, while they secretly begged the Madonna to protect their married sons and daughters from their husbands' or wives' ways. At the same time the church ladies were doing their praying, Violet was on the road driving to church. She was late. Her bloody eye would have been a shallow excuse to the gods who appreciated the sacrifices of true martyrs. With one hand, she used a full roll of paper towels and pressed it firmly over the bruises to stop its bleeding. She used the other hand to grip the steering wheel. The church was only a mile away, thank God. When she got close enough, she made a wide U-turn and jumped over the approaching curb without the slightest notice. She then put everything in park and got out and limped into the church. From the shoulders down, other than her perfumed cloud of camphor phenique that followed her, Violet was girdled, nylon, and tucked, wearing her Sergio Rossi high heels like any other morning. From the neck up, it was a different story. Her eyelids were fat and puffy. The right eyeball lost all its white. A rage of purple-like color filled its socket. Blood was stuck around the cut on her forehead. The statues of saints and virgins saw Violet walk into the church and stopped their solemnness to look at their newest little martyr. One lady, still settling herself in the pew, saw Violet and screamed. The scream echoed throughout the church, changing the holy deadness in the air. A crowd of ladies rummaged out of their anointed pews and circled around Violet and her bloody wound. A few ladies dug into their pockets and purses for Kleenex to wipe the blood that now dripped down Violet's neck and made a line around the collar of her white blouse. Other women beat their breasts, trying to remember the patron saint for bad cuts. Violet would know, but no one was going to ask her. The little priest with the purple cape floated down the altar steps and melted into the back of the fold. He could not see Violet's face or the blood. The rank of service had reversed its order. The ladies were now the apostles of the moment. Ellie finished telling me about the fall, my mother driving in her wounded condition, and how all the ladies in the church came to her rescue. Oh, God, this was not good. Violet went to church twice a day, once in the morning at 7 o'clock Mass and again at 6:30. She was not necessarily a religious zealot. She never pushed her beliefs on anyone or solicited any lost souls. She was just Catholic. Her life was wrapped up in that mesmerizing rituals of magic and mystery. She believed in God and talked to the ghosts in her heart, the Jesuses, the Marys, and the Abrahams. God gave Violet all kinds of signs to live by. They were simple signs. But Violet was a bit more extravagant in her desires and her requests. She would tell God exactly what she needed. If his answer didn't fit her plan, she would just discard it, whether it was a blessing from God himself or not. Of course, Violet kept this to herself. She didn't want to hurt God's feelings. But at 6:30, Violet was religiously devoted to her nighttime televangelist. His followers called him Sajak. Bishop Sajak was a small, suited, unassuming man who read from the Holy Wheel of Fortune. and talked about bankruptcy, wild cards, and trips to the promised land, a winning resort in the Cabo, and all expenses paid. Sister Vanna was his assistant, an attractive blonde woman with a wide, fixed billboard smile. She wore soft chiffon gowns and floated across an altar staged in neon green squares. The bishop's sacred message was hidden in the letters behind those chosen squares. At 6:30 at my mother's house, everything stopped. Violet would sit on the edge of the sofa, push her knees up against the cluttered table that was only just a few feet between the television and herself, and turned on Bishop Sajak. She then made the sign of attention and wiggled her glasses. On her lap, she had a spiral ring tablet filled with scribbled information lost in its importance. She pressed on the volume button on the remote and then tucked it under her arm. The televangelist just finished his introductions and was about to address his congregation and his contestants. Bishop Sajak spoke in letters to all his devoted followers everywhere. Violet called out consonants and bought vowels, hoping to make the bishop's squares light up. Chosen squares illuminated themselves in Windex blue. Sister Vanna gently tapped on the square's shoulder, asking the square to reveal itself. Bells would ring and the skies would open. The chosen square would silently scream, exposing its letter. I'm a D. I'm the letter D. Yes, I'm the glorious letter D. Hallelujah. 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 With just a few letters revealing themselves, nervous believers everywhere tried desperately to guess the bishop's message. The service finished at 6:58. Violet got up from the couch and walked over to the kitchen counter, where a silent phone waited for instructions. She pressed the ring button to the on position. Violet would now accept incoming phone calls. Ellie told me my mother was in the hospital. She fell. Okay, I had to think about this. The facts are, my mother fell. Everybody falls. But then, why did she drive to church? She had to know that no matter how hard she pressed an entire roll of paper towels against the wound, it wasn't going to stop the bleeding. I cracked my head open once, dancing on a coffee table. Ugh, it was a bloody mess. The taxi was scheduled to arrive at 5 a.m., California time. I needed a ride to the airport to catch the 6:15 flight. I double-locked the door and padlocked the roll-up. Inside, all my paint cans had their lids hammered down. A few stubborn brushes were soaking in a paint bucket resting on the utility sink. Overall, the studio was creatively clean. My return ticket said 3 weeks. I thought that was a generous, yet serious amount of time. My bags and I waited outside the warehouse. I was fully travel-dressed in my California to Chicago winter wear. It was always the same, a white T-shirt under my zippered wool vest that was under my black leathered bomber jacket. I wore 2 cotton skirts, one on top of the other, for warmth, and my signature black tights with Uggs. I dressed bed warm and ready for Chicago's December weather. Only 2 street lights worked in the front of my studio, and both were quite nervous. One was rather shy with its light, the other stuttered. The fog tried to help the street lights by spreading its fluorescentness a bit further, like water on a paper towel. I already called ahead for the taxi. It should have been here by now. I was waiting for what seemed like hours, but only 7 minutes actually passed. Okay, now it was 20 minutes. I was getting very close to craziness when a man on the other side of the street walked out of his house with a steaming mug in his hand. His other hand held a silver lighter close to a fat cigar that was clamped down with his teeth. He stood under a tarred overhang until the cigar was properly lit. He wore a white t-shirt and loose jeans that ended just above his ankles, and red suspenders. His hair was sparse, cut short, and cropped. His mustache was dark, full, and bushy. The framed house was white and cluttered with junk, treasures and memories lost in their purpose. A short picket fence kept everything contained in a small area that was about 8 feet from the building. A screen door rested upright on its side, unattached to its door. Big garbage bags filled with empty beer cans filled the untreasured areas. The man appeared to be a collector of sorts, an entrepreneurial junkman, a revered keeper of lost memories. I never formally met the man. I only knew of him as the junk man. The junk man looked at me as if he were trying to make out what I was doing, standing there in the wet fog. He appeared curious, but not very interested. He moved around his collections. I stared at him. My mind was trying to think of other alternatives. I didn't want to feel desperate, but I needed to get to the airport. My eyes moved from the junk man to a beat-up blue Chrysler at the edge of his property. I always assumed it was his vehicle. It matched his house. I squinted a bit to get a closer picture of the car. I needed to weigh my risks. Heavy smoke-stained windows prevented any viewing of contents inside the vehicle. An urgency pushed me from behind. I surrendered to what I needed to do. I walked to the other side of the street and stopped in front of the junk man's property and spoke. Hello, I live right there across the street. Oh, of course you know that. Why would I be standing there? And you probably saw me before. Well, the gist of it is that I'm in a bit of a jam. You see, I need to get to the airport rather quickly, but I'm waiting for my friggin' taxi and... My eyes left the face of the junk man and scanned up and down the street looking for some reason to stop what I was about to ask. Well, I don't know where in the hell the damn taxi is, but I need to catch this flight. You see, my mother fell. She lives in Chicago. Nobody else can go, and they called me. And, well, I don't need to tell you my whole story, but not that it's a sad story. I mean, she's going to be fine. I mean, she's as strong as a horse, for God's sake. It's just, well, I was really kind of hoping, if you have the time, maybe in the next few, well, actually, I mean right now. The junk man pulled a cigar out of his mouth. Do you think you can drive me to the airport? I'll buy you a case of Budweiser for your trouble. I couldn't help but notice you like Budweiser. It's a good beer, Budweiser. I once had one, a Budweiser. Not a beer. I've had lots of beers. I love beer. My father drank beer, not Budweiser. He drank Pilsner. Nobody else can go, and they called me. Oh, God, I wish I'd just shut up. He swaggered out the gate and rested his steaming coffee on the ledge of the short picket fence. He dug one hand into his side pocket and fished out a set of keys. He then walked to his car. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. I just followed, like a lamb about to be skinned. I prefer using the word skinned instead of slaughtered. Junkman opened the passenger door. Papers and plastic bottles fell out. He shoved a loose pile to one side and made just enough room for me to sit. I slid in and balanced my feet on the layered floor of paper, plastics, and God knows what. The junk man put my duffel bag in the back and got in on the driver's side. Nothing was said at first. Normal chit-chat lost its hospitality somewhere in the garbage. I saw a similar episode like this on Law & Order. Body parts of a gifted artist was found in garbage bags filled with crushed Budweiser cans. The junk man rested his arm out the window and twirled his cigar around his pursed lips. I turned my head and looked out the smoke-filled windows. When we got close to the terminal's curb, I found myself opening the door before the car fully stopped moving. When the car stopped at the curb, I cautiously extended my hand and offered to pay him for the ride.
I prefer cans, not bottles.
There are places in this world where no one lives, no one belongs, and no one is welcome to stay for any extended length of time. These places are located in between countries, between worlds and time zones. They are primarily used as transfer centers for millions of traveling migrants. The migrants fly around in pod-like spacecrafts. When their craft lands at one of these places, identified as airports, an accordion, stripped of its song, expands out to meet the pod. As the pod opens its door, the accordion sucks out the traveling migrants and spits them out into a terminal. I was one of those regular airport migrants. I had a red-eye classification. I navigated my way through the crowd of wrinkled travelers. It was late and cold. I lusted for coffee, but the terminal at that time was an iridescent ghost town lined with a string of stores covered by corsets of stretched metal. Their neon faces were done. Everything was closed. I moved past the corseted stores, past the moving walkways and through the neon tunnel to a large room. On one side was a long line of glass doors. The doors worked for the airport. They opened themselves to any travelers walking by their sensors. No one could live in the airport world. The doors' jobs was to entice passing bodies and push them out of the building, throwing them back into the real world. No one had a choice, and there were no exceptions. The terminal already had a number of ghosts, previous travelers who refused to leave. Now, I believe those non-compliant travelers were eventually captured and stuffed in unclaimed baggage. Their families will never be notified. On the opposite side, baggage carousels carried the Samsonites, the Duffels, and the Louis Vuittons. My duffel fell into the carousel first. Lucky, I guess. The duffel and I walked out of the terminal. The doors behind us folded themselves tightly, sealing the airport world shut. I walked to the curb where the limos and taxis picked up the traveling migrants. It was snowing hard. The cold slapped my face and made my eyelids jump and twitch. I was careful to take in just enough of the Arctic air that my body required. Layers of clothing protected my skin from freezer burn. I pushed my arms up into my jacket. My hands squished together the bottoms of the jacket sleeves. I forgot my gloves. I remembered to bring 8 sunglasses, but not a single pair of gloves. On a small sheet of paper that I tucked in my Uggs, I wrote the license number given to me by the limo cab service. The man driving these numbers would take me to my mother's house. I hoped the numbers would match J.D.'s limo. He had picked me up from the airport several times. There was an odd bond between us, an enchanting connection that was warm. I felt safe from the world when I was in his limo. When he spoke, his words were large and never cluttered with worldly drama. Sometimes we would talk the entire time of the drive. Other times, barely a word was spoken. I bounced up and down to prevent freezing while keeping my eyes focused on the passing vehicles. The wet snow glazed the limos, cabs, and buses. Round, wiggly lines of color followed them from behind. Goose-down people standing around me waved randomly at cars that passed in hope of being recognized. Before I could finish a thought, a long black limo stopped a few feet away from where I was standing at the curb. A man jumped out quickly and ran around the limo. It was J.D. I jumped into the limo quickly. It was warm inside and smelled of jasmine. Not the real jasmine, of course, but I was just as pleased with the processed scent. J.D. moved quickly in the snow slush and jumped into the driver's side of the car. His hair was covered with white. In seconds, the white went away, leaving wet, narrow cornrow patterns of curves and swirls that gave his head a distinctive shape. It was snowing hard. J.D. moved into traffic and drove straight into the white air. It was the first snow of the season. The top inches were fresh and clean, giving Chicagoans a good impression of winter before the streets had a chance to stir it up like dirty flour. The white filled the highway wall to wall. The road changed and glazed itself as big trucks were grinding salt crystals, flavoring the streets. The windshield wipers squeaked and swayed back and forth sassy-like, pushing the winter to one side. I sat on a soft leather couch that extended the full length of the limo. At the bottom was a rope of lights in neon blue that went from one end of the limo to the other. The ceiling had tiny white stars, whose intention, I imagine, was to make you feel like you were miles away on some exotic island looking up at the summer sky. I bent over and looked at the line of lights under my seat. When I sat back up, I met J.D.'s smile in the windshield's mirror. His perfectly lined white teeth filled the reflecting glass. He knew something was different. I was more anxious, lost. He could never ask, and he just wouldn't. It was not in his nature to walk into someone's space without being formally invited. Nevertheless, J.D. kept a concerning watch over me in his rearview mirror. There we talked several times without uttering a single word. My head was filled with daughter's chatter. I am basically a thoughtful person, but now I found myself in a place that might require more character than I can muster up. I couldn't stop thinking, what is going to happen to my paintings and my colors, all my gear that I left behind in the warehouse? I worked too hard to be deprived of my brushes and my art for any great length of time. I looked down at the dried paint on my hands. They were the colors from a painting I was working on last night. I always felt warm and centered and somewhat grounded when my hands were spotted with paint that survived its washing. Picking the dried paint off my skin was an indulging and warming distraction. I first peeled away the dry paint under the nail parts. Specks of color fell onto my lap and scattered across my skirt, looking somewhat like a painting of Seurat or maybe Jackson Pollock. Oh my God, were these specks on my lap giving me a message? Telling me of my future? A future including the care and feeding of another individual? A mom, for example? Oh my God, I don't even own a plant. There was no turning back now. I felt summoned. I was the chosen one to fulfill the deed. The obligation of my mother's concerns was deposited right here on my lap. I had no choice. I was the undocumented creative living in a traditionalist world illegally. I had to be sacrificed for the good of the whole. I felt my bones shake under the weight of my demise. All my thoughts were running all over the place, from saintly to pure psychotic. I began to see my family solely as breeders who bore children as chattel for this very moment. Traditions scrambled in my head, bumping into each other. They seemed to be growing willy-nilly to places where panic and the worst scenarios survived by sucking the blood of daughtered artists. It's dangerous to think too much. It fixes it. It nails it down, and then your thoughts bleed. Oh, chop me up in a meat grinder and serve me to cats. Label it low-grade bitch meat. I'm not ready for this. I want to go home. I screamed inside myself, just stop for God's sake. I took several deep breaths and told myself, okay already, let's think about this. Come on now. Mama's like a bull for God's sake. Seriously. She is just too damn stubborn to give in to anything that's going to change her life. She's going to be fine. Finished. I'm done. I closed my head. I would think nothing more of anything that had to do with an uncertain future. The snow turned to rain and came down like glass-beaded curtains falling across the road. It clattered against the limo, making a sound like a sea pearls falling from the sky. From the street, my mother's house looked abandoned. Window blinds were shut, keeping the inside trapped. The house was bundled in snow. Heavy mounds sat on the rooftop, looking like visiting sea lions that stopped to take a rest before they returned to the ocean. The driveway was packed with snow and ice, causing the limo to slide closer to the front door before it stopped. J.D. gave me that wink as I left the limo, the wink that always brought me back into the soul of the moment where everything was simpler and clear. His limo drove away. I held on to the red backlights until they turned into tiny wet crystals dissolving into the white. The snow wet my face. I was in two minds. I desperately wanted to chase after him, but I couldn't move, forward or back. I stood on the edge of decisions and looked around. The snow blurred what was ahead. Well, that is pretty much how this all started. From the first phone call in my studio to the front door of an eye-opening adventure. Prepare yourself to be unplugged from the world. My name is Suzka, the creator and producer of the Dementialand podcast.